This is the final session, and then we're going to have a mop-up of all that we've done in the 2 days towards the end of the afternoon. And I've got two presentations for you. One's about the performers' trade unions, our guilds and associations. They're called different things in different parts of the world. And I'll talk quite a lot about the history of my union. It's interesting, there's going to be a book published in next month in September. And it's been the researchers at the University of Glasgow in Scotland have decided to write the history of the first 120 years of the British Musicians Union. So this is going to be a little bit of general stuff now about trade unions, about guilds and everything, and how come the musicians ended up with one. So the definitions of trade unions are sort of difficult to come by. Different academics have different views of it. Organised collectives of people working within a given sector. Our sector's music, of course, and it's performance of music, which through negotiation aim to improve paying conditions. There's a problem with that general definition. That could apply to transport workers, it could apply to workers in lots of different industries. But to negotiate, you've got to have somebody to negotiate with. And the problem in our sector is often you haven't, because there's so many different employers. When I did Status of the Artist yesterday, that was one of the things, the barriers to actually taking this profession forward. But that's the kind of thing we're looking at. So, trade union is definitely a representative democracy. You can't have mass meetings of the whole members to make decisions. You've got to have a system of governance. So it's governed by its members, and it's administered by an internal democracy. I'll say more about that in a minute. Come on. Yeah, so trade unions usually have to be registered with a governmental body. We have to do that in the UK. We have to provide returns. In fact, the law governing trade unions is a lot more strict than it is governing companies. That goes back to good old Mrs. Thatcher, who wanted to really have a go at people like me. But we have to register the interests we look after. And it's particularly the case in the US and Europe, this registration. Doesn't happen in some other countries. Funnily enough, in Africa, where you've got some quite authoritarian regimes in some countries, it's more free and easy when it comes to this. So how does the governance work? And it's generally there has to be a representative body. Now, people call it all sorts of things. General Assembly is used by lots of my European colleagues. Convention is what the Americans call their meetings. Congress or conference. My union has a conference every 2 years. It's not going to happen this year. This is the fallow year. It's going to take place next year. The American Federation of Musicians has a convention every 3 years, and they just had theirs just a couple of months ago. So it takes place regularly, but not too regularly. You know, you can't be Murray-bound by administration, which is a danger. And what happens, the delegates are asked to elect, to be elected. The members are asked to elect delegates to the conference or the Congress. Now, you can do this in all sorts of ways. You can do it on a geographical basis, and that's the way we do it in the UK. The union's divided into 6 regions around the country, and they all have an allotted number of delegates depending how many members belong to that region. The other way of doing it is you look at genres of music and you make sure you get the coverage from each genre. So you could have, we've got committees that deal with all sorts of music. You could have jazz musicians, recording musicians, folk musicians, classical musicians, and importantly, like I said yesterday, musicians who teach, because I think it's very important for them. You have the equivalent of a board, which we call the executive committee, executive council in some countries. This is elected on that same basis as the delegates to the Congress. It could be geographical, it could be what I call industrial, so the different kinds of branches of music within the industry. They're limited to a term of office. They have to apply for re-election every 3 years, so you keep that turnover. And we do it on an alternating system, so we've got One lot do their 3 years and another lot sort of coincide. So they don't all come up for election at the same time. It alternates. So you've continuity, but you've also got change every year. According to the rules of my union, that executive has all the powers of the union. So it's not me, I'm the general secretary, I kind of head the union, but I've got to go and ask permission of the actual musicians to actually make policy. But the individual executive committee members don't have any power at all. They have the same power as any member of the union. It's only when they get together in the committee that they get that power. So it's a collective, again, this is all to do with collectivism. It's a collective decision-making body. And that's what makes it very powerful. So this is the role that I fulfilled in the UK. The head of the unions are usually called general secretaries. In the USA, it's presidents, chief executive of the union. There are many ways of doing this. In the UK, it's governed by law. So I have to get elected by a ballot, and it's a postal ballot. You have to do it by mail, which is very expensive, every 5 years. My colleague in the States gets elected at the convention every 3 years. And it's a kind of, and by acclaim this time, so nobody stood against him. So it's, he's got another 3 years there. So we have to make sure that that part of it is democratic. You're accountable to the members. And I think the whole thing depends on democracy. You've also, let's get these up. You also have an important role as with the chairman of the executive. Now, I use chairman, but it could be a woman. We had a woman until last year. So, but I don't like the word chairperson. And then I did have a colleague who didn't like being called a chair. So, you know, that's a chair. It's sort of, yes. So terminology can get really difficult. But they chair the meetings of the executive. They keep order. Very important. They can be the figurehead. They can talk to the press. They can give statements. And we've got, in my union, we've got 3 vice chairs. There could be vice presidents. And that forms the day-to-day administrative committee. They're the ones that I contact in between meetings, say, look, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Can we do this? Do you think we ought to do this? That kind of question. So, again, the democracy runs through everything. So specifically for the UK, and this is terminology used by the broadcasters, they talk about the talent unions. So our colleagues are equity, who look after actors, dancers, variety acts, circus performers, and they actually have singers there. We'll come on to singers later. There is a little bit of a dispute about singers. It's interesting. They have lots of very niche things to look after. Dancers are very different to look after the musicians and have very different problems. They look after stuntmen in the film industry, which can be quite hazardous. When you actually go, they had to dispute once about, they were making a movie about horse racing. And in the contract, it said that any horse riding had to be done by the stuntmen. And these are big guys, you know. Because a horse racing jockey is a very small guy who gets on the racehorse. So they demanded that they did the riding on the horses. And they had proper jockeys lined up. So we had to get a compromise. I think in the end, Equity negotiated that they got a payment and didn't ride the horses. So it was, honour was satisfied. So yeah, so it's a very different union to the Musicians' Union. The other one we're quite close to is the Writers' Guild of Great Britain. There's also a Writers' Guild in the USA. Quite powerful. These are small unions, but these are really important people who write the scripts for TV programs, or write the scripts for stage plays, write the scripts for movies. And I think it was the Writers' Guild of America that went on strike last year or the year before and almost froze the Hollywood studios. And then there's us. And I put down instrumentalists, music writers. I've used the term carefully there because a lot of the work we do is for arrangers. And it's for copyists, the people that sort of copy out. And often when you're doing big sessions, film sessions for instance, in big studios, they're copying the music as the musicians are playing. So they're actually quite skilled because you've got to be able to read it. So we do a lot of work for them. And then instead of singers, I put vocalists to make that distinction, because The very, very loose demarcation between us and Equity About Singers is if it's primarily a band with instrumentalists, with a vocalist, then they belong to the Musicians Union. If it's a band that's primarily singers, they tend to go in with Equity. It's not that simple. A lot of them have got dual membership, particularly the session singers who work in the studios. So, let me tell you a little bit now about my union. As I said, it's very old, formed in 1893. It has to take the initiative of somebody to be formed, and I told you yesterday about the circular that went around, and this was the 7th of May 1893. There'd been a couple of incidents. It was all based in Manchester, a very industrial town, and what had happened at that time in the UK and a lot of Europe and in North America is that they talk about the second industrial revolution. This is when industry was getting going. This was when Karl Marx was writing his books about how people were exploited in the factories, and there was a big movement in the few years before then from the countryside into the cities. Charles Dickens writes about it a lot. It's all fascinating stuff, but the social movements were really people were in a bad way, and they actually formed into unions to try and improve their own lot. There'd been another movement earlier in the 19th century. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Tolpuddle Martyrs. These were agricultural workers, and they formed a group to look after themselves against the landowners. What they did, they kind of swore allegiance to each other, that they'd support each other, back each other, and look after each other. The authorities said that was swearing an oath and is against the law of the Crown. They were transported to Australia. They were just taken away from their families and sent off. 2 of them came back. But yeah, it was pretty heavy duty. So all this was going on, and the musicians were unhappy about what was going on, particularly, as I said, the theatre musicians. This all started with the theatre musicians, which was a really popular form of entertainment in those days. They were really concerned with what was going on. There were attempts to form groups in some of the big cities, Birmingham and in Manchester in the 1870s, but didn't come to anything because nobody would kind of organise it. Nobody would actually take the initiative. And it's difficult, I think, because musicians are performing. It's actually quite hard. But then this circular was put together. It's put together by this clarinet player called Joe Williams. He was very young. He was only about 23. And the story is that his mother, Katie, was the one that really drove and wrote this letter and got him to do this and was the driving force. Now then, considering you've got the gender session tomorrow, this is very 19th century and gender specific. So it starts, gentlemen, which it would, wouldn't it? The phrase, we ought to have a union, is often uttered by musicians, especially when they're compelled, for want of society, to rehearse without remuneration. Unfortunately, with the phrase, the matter drops. In other words, they just talk about it. No one seems inclined to start a union, yet on all sides it's admitted that one is necessary. The union we require is a protecting union, and one that will protect us from amateurs, protect us from unscrupulous employers, and protect us from ourselves. A union that will guarantee our receiving a fair wage for our engagements, a society that will keep the amateur in his place and prevent his going under prices, a union that will see you are paid for extra rehearsals and in time raise salaries to what they ought to be. So there were real grievances there, and they had a big issue about people going in and undercutting them. And that happens now, you know, like I said before, nothing really changes. The union grew very quickly. By the end of the 1890s, there were about 3,000 members across the UK, mainly based in the big cities, and it grew really powerfully before the First World War. By the time we get to the 1910 to 1912, there are about 20,000 members. And then the first really big incident comes along, and I'll just tell you about this because it's a great story, I think. You've all heard of the Titanic. And when the ship went down, the band played on. Some people think it's an apocryphal story, but there were lots of witnesses that said that what happened is the boat was going from Southampton in the UK to New York. It hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic. It was brand new. They said it was unsinkable. It was the state-of-the-art transport at the time, and it was going under. And the band actually got their instruments out and they stood on the deck while people were going into the lifeboats. And they actually played through their repertoire. Now, the story is that they were playing some ragtime until the water went over their feet. And then the leader of the band, who was a guy called Wallace Hartley, who came from the north of England, from Burnley in Lancashire, he was a devoutly religious man. And he was sort of waiting for this moment, and he decided he had a number of hymn tunes that he thought they should play at that particular moment. And the story is that the tune they played is Nearer My God to Thee, as the final lifeboats were going down, and people that couldn't get on the lifeboats were having to jump in. The band actually packed their instruments up when all the lifeboats had gone. And the story again is that Hartley decided that one of the great loves of his life was his violin, and he strapped the case on the front of him before he jumped into the water. You're jumping into the North Atlantic, you know, this is cold water. And again, the story is that when he was found, the violin case was there, and it disappeared for years. Recently, somebody said they'd found it. Now, I think that I'm not sure how the verification of that happened, but it was sort of taken away. His body was repatriated to the UK, and he had a very formal ceremony in the north of England where he came from. And there's a memorial there to him as the band leader of the Titanic. There were 8 musicians, and they were all members of what was then called the Amalgamated Musicians Union. Wallace Hartley was the leader, as I said. It's quite interesting, the makeup. For that, particularly those times, there was a cellist called Roger Bruchot, who started working in the casinos in the south of France. He worked in Monte Carlo, the casino. He ended up in Liverpool. Now, I don't know how that happened in those days. It would be odd enough now. So he was a young man who actually started to work in the UK. There was a guy called Theo Brayley, who was a pianist but a multi-instrumentalist. He was a Londoner. There was Wes Woodward, was another violinist who actually, and all these guys worked on the ships. They worked on the boats, and they earned quite a good living doing that. We had another Frenchman called Georges Crin, who actually spent most of his life living in Belgium. He was another cellist. John Clark and Percy Taylor. And then there was a young man called John Law Hume, who was only aged 20. He was the youngest of the band. He was a violinist, and he was a kind of joker of the pack, evidently, so they say. There's a tragic story. There's a tragic story about a number of them, but with John Hume, he'd got on the boat. He was obviously a talented musician. He didn't have an instrument, so he rented 2 violins, and he actually got on the boat with them. He left, the idea was he was going to earn some money, because these guys did earn quite good money. They got tips as well. You remember, very rich passengers on these liners. And he was going to go back to marry his fiancée, who was pregnant at the time. So he was killed in this shipwreck, and his body was never found. But in the week after the tragedy, his father got a bill from the White Star Line, which was like Cunard, you know, it was the actual shipping line, for alterations made to his band uniform. They sent him the bill, and, you know, insensitive or what? It was really ridiculous. And there are other stories like that as well. Just to finish off Hume's story, the baby was born, and his family disowned the girl. They didn't want anything to do with her. The money they paid, they got compensation eventually. I'll talk about that in a minute, because it pertains to the life of a musician. The money came, they paid it to the father, and he wouldn't pass it on. She went to the union. She wasn't a member, remember, she wasn't a musician, and they took it to court, and we actually took the father to court and got her just compensation for that. And I don't know what the dad did about the bill for the clothes. But yeah, so, you know, this was a real tragedy in every way. But when it came to it, they were looking for compensation. The employees of the shipping line, the merchant sailors, the stewards, the people who worked in the bar, the cleaners and everything, had a kind of compensation system. Very primitive in those days, not like hopefully there is now. The musicians didn't. because the musicians were employed by an agent based in Liverpool. And this agent was always putting bands onto the ocean liners, also bands into theatres, into holiday resorts, into hotels. They were quite active. It was Charlie Black was the name of the agent, and it was him and his brother that ran it. And they'd had run-ins with the Musicians' Union in those days because of the way they treated the artists. When it was looked at by the courts, the contract was between the agent and the musicians, not between the White Star Line and the musicians. So the pot of money, and this had money that was given by the government as well, didn't apply to them. So initially they weren't going to get any compensation whatsoever, their family and their children. The union did a number of things. It created merry hell. It really raised the roof and was in all of the press about this, about the unfair treatment of musicians. It held what I think is still the biggest concert, an aid of any kind of tragedy, probably Live Aid, just because of television, went over that. But it was at the Albert Hall, the Royal Albert Hall in London. It had a load of musicians, popular musicians from London at the time, 3 symphony orchestras. There's a picture of this massive thing, the orchestra on stage and the audience in Edwardian dress. And they raised quite a lot of money, primarily for the musicians. And that went there, and it kind of highlighted this employment chain. And there again, that's something that hasn't changed. That's the same. You often get musicians thinking they're employed by somebody, but they're not. They've been engaged by somebody else, which is back to what Keith was talking about earlier. Read the contract. Make sure you know who you're working for. So the union was very involved with that. That was 1912. Then we had the war in Europe. It was a lot of musicians enlisted. The membership went down, but it kind of stabilized, and there was the time in the 20s was quite an active period, and then they were hit by one of the most serious crises they ever faced. And that was because at that time theatres had kind of gone away. They weren't as popular as they were before, but cinema was, and it was mainly silent films. And there were big orchestras employed in movies. And it's not, often you'll see something on TV and it's, somebody playing a piano. That wasn't always the case. That was maybe in very small towns. In the big towns, and in London, there was a cinema, 2 cinemas, one in Leicester Square and one near Edgware Road, which is kind of northwest London. They had over 100 musicians on contract. And what would happen is the movies were almost exclusively made in America. The scores would go across on the ocean liners. The musicians would rehearse them. They'd perform in the evening. There'd be about 8 shows a week, sometimes more. And it was a very good living for them. Then in 1927, there's a film called The Jazz Singer. And that was the first talking movie. And all work stopped. They were put out of work almost overnight. And the membership of the union went down from about 25,000 to about 12,000, or even less. Half the musicians put it out of work. And it's quite funny because the history of the British Musicians' Union and the American Federation of Musicians is a fight against technology. And there's lots of publicity material in cartoons saying the public are going to get back to their senses soon. Who wants all this talking? Who wants this? Get proper films back for them. And of course, you're fighting a battle you can never win. But it's interesting because when one door closes, and some people say another slams in your face, but actually often a door does open, and it was broadcasting. We came on board. So suddenly there were lots of opportunities for broadcasters in the late 1920s. So it's kind of, that's been repeated. And, we talked a lot about streaming yesterday. These are the same things happening again. Technology's changing. The way you earn your living is changing. What we're talking about yesterday is that musicians earn less money because of the nature of streaming and the price of streaming. Well, that was the same then, right back in the 1920s. So it's a fascinating thing. It's why I say you have to try and learn from your past. So there were 2 organisations. The organisation I'm talking about is the Amalgamated Musicians' Union, which is the one based in Manchester. The National, which became the National Orchestral Association, was a bit snobbish. It was the orchestras. They didn't really want to associate with the theatre musicians and the sort of hotel musicians. They kind of regarded themselves as an elite, but they went bust, and they couldn't survive as an elite. They were quite small. They merged in 1921, and the orchestral musicians, more or less about the same percentage today with my union. We're sort of less than 10% of the full thing. So it just shows what the cross-section was. So back to the way to summarize on the governance. So my union now, members elect the executive committee by postal ballot, elected by the regions. Members elect the general secretary by postal ballot, 5-year period. Members elect delegates for a conference every 2 years. Then the general secretary is responsible for appointing all the full-time officials and staff of the union who actually administer it. And we've got about 50 people working for us in the UK, across the country, about 30 in London, because that's where the main part of the union is, the music industry is. So the 6 regions, Scotland, Northern Ireland, we bump them together, so we don't regard them as countries, we regard them as regions, and they're okay with that, just. The north of England, which is a massive part, right across the top of the north, from those of you who know the UK, Newcastle, down to sort of Chester, Carlisle, down to sort of Lincoln. The Midlands, those counties in the centre of England, Wales and southwest England, and southeast England, outside London. London's a region of its own, and 1/3 of our members live in London, live and work in London. So the committees, they all have committees. There are 6 regional committees, again elected by ballot, and the regions elect their delegations to the conference, like I said. On top of that, we've got sections. Now, we kind of rejigged the sections recently because we did have them more by genre, and it was, we had a jazz section, we had a folk section, folk and roots music section, we had an orchestral section, we had a theatre section, and you know, they got kind of exclusive rather than inclusive. They were keeping people out rather than letting people in. And then we decided to rejig it and look at the way people work. So a jazz musician and a folk musician does the same kind of work, basically. They might do a little bit of recording, they mainly do live performances, they kind of work in the same venues. So we decided that this is the best way to do, to follow the type of work rather than genre of music. Open to all members, they can elect to go into more than one section, but they've got to nominate what their main one is. They get a newsletter just for that section. So if it's live performance, they get issues twice a year just to do with live performance. They elect their own committees as well. I'm full of committees. I've got committees coming out of my ears. And they advise and they recommend, as I say. They don't make decisions. Then we still have sort of industrial sections. And we got musicians who work in recording broadcasting, musicians work in live performance, orchestras. We've got an equalities committee, which kind of, I'll say a bit more about that later, doesn't really sit in with this structure, but there's nowhere else to put it. And we got a very important teachers section, which is the biggest one in the union.
Sorry, John. So in terms of having these different industrial sections, maybe you'll speak to the governance structure later, but how do you ensure that one isn't dominating?
Yeah, a good point, yeah. I think the way that's ensured is that the decisions can only be made by the executive. So like I say, they make recommendations only. So you can get kind of dominant personalities or push issues through, looking after themselves, which could disadvantage musicians working in other fields. So the executive has to keep that balance. And it kind of works. There's lots of arguments, but you know, it does work generally. The equalities is interesting. We look at what they call the protected characteristics. And you know, you're going to talk about gender tomorrow. And that's a really important issue. I think I said yesterday that the makeup of my union and lots of similar ones around the world tend to be mainly men. The union fluctuates 3/4 to 1/4, men, women, sometimes 2/3, 1/3. And it's been like that for years and years and years. It's strange because when you look at the employed situations, so you look at people that work in theatres in West End of London, you look at people who work in the orchestras, the gender balance is actually pretty good. And that wasn't, when I was a young musician, that wasn't the case. It was all men as well. But that's changed. But you know, it's the other genres, it's rock and pop, it's jazz, it's folk as well, that tends to be the guys in the band and the girl as the vocalist. I think I did meet a music ethnologist once, and she'd written a paper on why is the girl always the singer. And it's interesting, because when you look at the makeup of bands, it's changed a bit, but generally it's still the same. So we look at that. Very important in the UK, we have to look at ethnicity. So we've got our black and minority ethnic part. And we actually have a number of musicians who come in and talk about how they get on in the business. Are they discriminated against? Generally, I think in music, in the performance of music, they're not. I think it's quite eclectic. If you're a good performer, you're a good performer. It's the women, I can't really explain the women-man thing, the gender thing, why that happens. And we've spoken to musicians, but we give them the opportunity at this committee to raise the issues they want to raise. And it's quite important to have that. Sorry. And then we got the LGBT, we got the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual. They've got to have a voice. They have some real issues. There's issues about discrimination when they're touring. They've faced all sorts of things. We try and raise the profile of the issues they bring to us. Probably the most tricky thing that we deal with is the disabled musicians. We've got to ensure people have good access to venues. And you know, when you're looking like a city like London, a city like New York, there's some great music venues there, some great theatres, some great concert halls, but you know, they're old. And it really is, the access really can be quite difficult. I was talking to musicians who are working in the West End of London doing the Phantom of the Opera. And that's a musical that's been on in London and toured the world for years now, 25 years. It's a theatre called Her Majesty's. It's in the centre of London. It's an old Victorian theatre. It's a beautiful building. The orchestra pit is almost buried. If there was a fire, it'd be bad enough for the able-bodied musicians to get out. Anybody who's disabled, you burn. You know, it really is bad. So we have to bring... Now, what we don't want to do is close that theatre, because, you know, our members wouldn't thank us, and neither would the public. So we've got to try and get the compromise. And we work with a number of other organisations. There's one called Attitude is Everything. And they kind of look at it from the audience point of view as well. Access to venues for the disabled audience. And they send out secret shoppers. So people go along and they just test it and they do a report, which is quite good. And it's quite good when you send the report to that venue. It's a big job, and things are changing, and it's something the union's very much involved with. Then we've got to communicate with our members. We've got to keep the message coming across, you know, that there are things happening they need to know about. I think you've got a copy of the latest edition of the Union Journal, Musician, in the pack that we sent. So you can see from that we try and cover every different kind of music, lots of different issues. We kind of talk a little bit about politics. We talk about where we're going with any policy that we have. And it's good. It's a good publication. It comes out 4 times a year. And it's quite valued by them. It's really expensive to produce, but you know, something we should do. We're using electronic communications much more now than we used to. We've got email addresses, we know live email addresses, good email addresses, because they fall off the end, email addresses, very quickly, for about 3/4 of our members. So we know that we can get in touch with most of them through email very quickly. And then you've got the book. This book here. Now, if you haven't got a copy, we've got PDFs that you can actually access. This has got all of the information you could possibly need in it. It's got, admittedly, perfunctory stuff, but it's got everything about the contracts we heard this morning. It's got about other things we talked about. It's advice about filling in your tax return. It's advice about how you look at your merchandise. It's advice about how you actually have govern your whole career as a musician. It's revised every year. I think we're going to send it every 2 years in future instead of every year. But it's great. It's won a couple of awards. The Trade Union Congress, TUC in the UK, with all the unions belong to, given this an award as one of the best services that you can actually give to them. And we make it this size so they can slip it into an instrument case. You can get this into a guitar case. You can get it in your drums. So if you're not sure, reference it. It's also got the phone numbers, you know, that they can get in touch with the office with. So that's quite important. The website, of course, everybody's got websites. You have to renew them often. You've got to keep them going. I'm not sure. It's the worst thing you can do is have a website and have it out of date, because they pick up on that. The information's got to be completely updated. So I've got one official who just deals with electronic communications, social media, and electronic media, basically. And she's really good. She's the youngest one. She's 27. She's actually magnificent. She does things that I just don't understand how they work, you know. But she's great. So yeah, and also the regions and the sections, I think I mentioned this, do have their own newsletters. On top of that, we've got to use social media. So the Twitter hashtag is We Are the MU, and we sort of send stuff out every day to members. Facebook page, you know, that can be where people moan. And they moan about, you know, life's not treating them well. You've got to watch Facebook. I think it's sort of prone to that. And Instagram, things that you're all very familiar with, I'm sure. Then we have to talk about jurisdiction, and this is quite interesting because there are areas that we have to be careful with. So, what we look after are the performers and the intellectual property rights that can be acquired through collective bargaining. I talked about the sync agreements and the agreements we've got with the record industry, that the performances can only be used, the recorded performance can only be used for certain things. If there are any other things, then they've got to actually pay some extra money. And that works very well. We have the same thing with the film industry in the UK, and those agreements apply to producers from other countries, like the American producers who come and record music there in London. We generally look after the non-featured musicians. So it's the orchestra musicians, the theatre musicians, the session musicians, when we're talking about collective bargaining. When we're talking about the bands that work on their own, there's nobody to bargain with. There's no employees association or anything. The American Federation have got an agreement with the hoteliers. So there's a number of hotel chains. We haven't got that, mainly because they all belong to Americans. So it's sort of difficult to kind of get hold of anybody to negotiate. So what we do in that case, we tell them what the rate, what they should get paid, what an average rate is, and what a fair rate is. So it's a unique role. I talked about how we sit in the trade union movement. None of them do this. So Intellectual Property Rights Administration, those sync fees, somebody's got to actually collect them and pay them out to the musicians, and we do that. We actually have a department that looks after royalties, and they'll collect anything that's generated by their exclusive rights. Remember, Keith was talking yesterday, there are exclusive rights, and there's equitable remuneration right and the moral rights. Well, the exclusive rights are a reproduction of their performance. So a sync is actually a reproduction of the initial performance in another product, and we collect the money for that and send it out to them. Debt recovery service. Well, a debt recovery service is when you don't get paid for the gig, and we are very litigious, our union. We're in the courts all the while, virtually every day, often chasing just a few £100 for the fee. And this is when the band have done the gig, and they've probably done it in a pub in some dodgy part of a dodgy city somewhere. And at the end of the evening, the manager, the landlord, says, "You were rubbish, off," you know, and they don't get paid. So it's down to us to actually chase that money for them. And we are almost always successful. We tend not to take things on we're not going to be successful with. The standard contracts, Keith was using a lot of the standard contracts. I think you sent them around, Keith. That what we do with those, we kind of put them together and look to the subject matter. We think we covered everything, and then we get a firm of lawyers that we use just to look at them, check them over. They are skeleton contracts. These are the very basics, and as Keith said, they're very artist friendly. Of course, we would be, but that's the starting point. That's where they have to go from. On top of that, we've got a contract advisory service. Now, this is the artist can come to us with a management agreement, they can come with a recording contract, with a publishing contract, and we have an agreement with a firm of lawyers, and they'll take the contract and they'll read through it, and they'll redline it, as the lawyers in the room know. They'll go through it and they'll say, this needs altering, that needs altering. Usually that's enough, because they can go back to the actual record company or the publisher or whoever it is and say, look, I've been advised to change this, a little bit of a negotiation. Sometimes they have to go and talk to the lawyers separately, so then they have to pay. But they get the first look at the contract free, which is a pretty good service, because that's going to cost a band a lot of money to have that looked at. Now, partnership advisory service is pretty new. I was talking about this yesterday. One of the things we find is it's great when somebody's starting their career. It's great when the band's got together. It's great when they're doing really good things and everything's going well. What about, inevitably, when they fall out and they're not friends anymore? In fact, they hate each other after a while. There's a lot of examples of that going on. And the obvious thing is, who owns the songs? Who owns the copyright in the songs? Because often they've kind of cobbled them together, working in the studio, rehearsing. They don't know. Somebody will claim they own the songs, but then there'll be a dispute. But it's even more basic than that. Who owns the band van? Who owns the transportation? Who owns the PA system they use? We've had examples of somebody's dad has given them some money to buy a good PA system and given it to the band. Now they say that's a gift. And the courts have to decide who that actually belongs to when it falls apart. And of course, when you sell it second-hand, it's got no value at all. It's sort of, the whole thing is really sad. So what we try and do is get them to sign a prenup. So they come together, they're all pals, they're all friends, and they sign this agreement about the division of the property the band owns. And by property, I include the songs and the music that they've written. How that might be divided if, or should we say when, they all split up. And it's quite interesting, because what you get these days is a lot of bands reforming when they get into their middle age. There's lots of bands touring now that were very popular when they were young, and they kind of all start to speak each other again because there's money in it. They've got a following. But we try and emphasize that this is something you should do. Just don't give money to the courts and to the legal profession. Much as we love the legal profession, try and bypass it by doing your own agreement and be sensible. They're not, by the way. We get it, it's used very little. And we've had bands come into the office and sit at opposite sides of the table, screaming and shouting at each other. And we kind of start off being the referee, and we sort of end up being the football and kicked by both of them. So it's a thankless task. So that's my advice to young bands, just look to the future. Then we offer, as a really good service, some insurances. And I'll go into this in the second presentation a bit more. Public liability, they get free insurance up to £5 million, and instrument and equipment insurance free up to the value of £2,000. They can supplement that after that. So, the union is this collective body. It actually has collective responsibility. Everybody's part of the decision-making process, or potentially can be part of it. It oils the wheels. It stops disputes. It nips things in the bud by having the union there. And this is not my quote, but this is a quote from an academic who's written on industrial relations. What they also do are they're the managers of discontent, because people aren't happy with their working lives often, and they do have quibbles and little moans. We're there to kind of be a buffer for that and to absorb it, so that when they get out there working for their record companies, working for their publishers, everything's hunky-dory, or as hunky-dory as it can be. And it's a voice for the artisan musicians, the jobbing musicians, as I call them. So that's that first presentation, and that's sort of background to what these organisations are. I suppose the only thing I was going to add to the presentation is how you actually form this. What do you start? Who makes the first effort? And the example, my example, goes way back 120 odd years. But that's the same now. You need somebody to take an initiative. You need somebody to take responsibility. It's best if it's a small group. And to explain to the others that this is the way to go forward. You need to have this collective voice. And you need to be able to talk to the authorities and to actually go to government and to say you represent the musicians. And but you also represent the musicians in the industry as well. So you've got this whole kind of infrastructure that's there supporting you. You're out there performing, somebody's got your back. And that's the important thing about it.